Thank you all for coming this morning at this early hour. As we all know, here in the Pacific Northwest, it rains a lot, and that water not only flows into streams, but a lot of it goes through wetlands. And wetlands are not just the huge tidal marshes like Nisqually down the road here. There are also some areas that many of us don't even recognize as wetlands. Just seeps and mucky areas out in the forest. And this is what I'm going to talk about this morning. I have two talks, one about the literature synthesis that I did, the other about the strategy for research, doing more research here on wetlands and forest practices. These two reports are currently available on my university website. They'll also be on the CEMER website very soon. And these are the two reports I'm going to be talking about this morning. So both documents cover forest practices. By that I mean tree removal, forest roads, and chemical applications to a lesser extent. What do we mean when we speak about the effects of forest practices on wetlands? Well, according to the way the WAC is written, it specifically says wetland functions are the focus of our concern. And what do we mean by wetland functions? We mean the things that wetlands do naturally without human interference, just as if nobody was looking. What do wetlands naturally do? Well, of course, they store water. So one big category is hydrology, looking at the water table and low flows, the effect of wetlands on these parameters, but also the effect of forestry practices on these, and then those in turn affecting those functions. Wetlands store runoff in some cases. They affect water yield and peak flows. And then in water quality, we know that wetlands, some wetlands have the capacity to store sediment, keeping it out of spawning areas in streams. Wetlands have profound impacts on nutrients, particularly nitrogen, in the landscape, and certainly on carbon. And the habitat functions, of course, vegetation structure, fish, amphibians, birds, and so on. So what are we talking about? Well, wetlands, as you know, encompass a wide variety of types. And Forest Practices Act, the way it's written, recognizes some differences in wetland type. The types that are recognized by Forest Practices and by National Wetland Inventory and others to varying degrees reflect the functions of wetlands, but there's not a perfect one-to-one correspondence between function and type. So we have areas like the top area here, very open, what most of us think of as a wetland. But then areas like this that most of us may think, hey, that's not a wetland, that's just a forest. Well, depending on the vegetation and the soils and the hydrology, it could very well likely be a wetland. And this is part of the problem in doing a wetland literature synthesis, is there may already be some studies that have been done here in wetlands in the Pacific Northwest, and we don't even know it because the authors of the study did not describe their research area or a portion of it as a, quote, wetland. So just some more examples of areas that are actually wetlands because of their soils and hydrology, not always wet. Areas like, some of these areas like this support fish, and I thank some of you other folks here in the audience for some of these slides. and they can include areas that have channels, seasonal or temporary, that support fish at some times of the year. So the literature synthesis document that I did, I was asked by CEMER to update and expand upon the review that was done earlier by Sarah Cook and others. The purpose of that literature review is to summarize the current knowledge, identify the connections between forest practices in wetlands and wetland functions, highlight some of the research needs. I'll get to that more in my second talk, and suggest some hypotheses. The context, as always, with this group is the Forest Practice Standards Act. So how did I do this literature review? The standard way, did keyword searches, not just the word wetland, but all kinds of synonyms for wetlands. Initially identified through Web of Science and Google Earth, or Google and other things, identified about 4,000 peer-reviewed papers, but this was a very broad net that I cast. I then pared it down to about 500 papers based, my main criteria were to focus on the Pacific Northwest and, specifically on wetlands. I read the abstracts of all 500 of those. I prioritized 135 of them, did a complete read of about the top 50. And the way I prioritized them again was, were they focused on this region and were they focused on wetlands. Now I did look at the forest practices literature from other regions on wetlands, but it was not a priority. Because we have very different environments here in the Northwest. I created an Excel database that you can sort by 100 different columns. You can sort by wetland function and see what literature has come out on that, by forest practice, by the state or province, and I did include BC and part of Alberta in this literature review. And you can sort by the forest practices type. Looking at the number of studies here in the Pacific Northwest of wetlands, excluding salt marshes, this is just non-tidal wetlands, there are about 134 such studies, and I included in that some riparian studies that I felt were probably including wetlands, although the authors did not specifically say that. And as you can see, I don't, what I'm reporting is basically null results, that the number of studies of forest practices in wetlands here in the Pacific Northwest, I found none. I was not surprised. I kind of expected that, but I tried really hard and couldn't come up with any. Now, if we expand that to riparian systems, about 83 studies. So my conclusions from the literature synthesis, no studies exist the way we define them, and there are many uncertainties. Still, a fundamental one is here in the Pacific Northwest, which wetlands perform which specific functions. We know that wetlands generally, for example, are very important for denitrification, but we have relatively little information on the different rates, how different wetland types compare in terms of their ability to control the flux of nitrogen in the landscape. And we know even less about how forest practices might affect that. Now, for other functions like support of coho, salmon, we can make some distinctions among wetland types. And we can look at hydrogeomorphic types and say, based on a wetland's hydrogeomorphic type, we think, we don't know, we think that certain types are more important than others. Another aspect, as I say, is which forest practices affect those functions. we need more BACI studies, the before-after control treatment kinds of studies. We've been hearing this for many years, of course, among those of you that study streams and other aspects of the landscape, and it's just as true for wetlands. Very few studies, even looking outside of the Pacific Northwest, very few studies of forest practices and wetlands with a BACI design. The literature review that I did, I said, you know, there were these 134, 35 studies that I considered, even though they weren't wetland studies, they were kind of in that ballpark. And you can see the breakdown here by topic. Of course, many papers had multiple topics, and kind of, you know, trying to sniff out what they were really getting at in terms of some of these topics was a challenge at times. And so because we didn't have any actual studies here in the Pacific Northwest of wetlands and forest practices, I did do some speculation and some inference as best I could based on my experience as a wetland scientist. And I think that generally in most landscape settings, we can expect that when you harvest the timber from within a wetland, you're going to have a rise in the water level, the water table, that is. You'll have greater water yield, and you may have some warming, although that depends greatly on the degree to which a given wetland is connected to the groundwater system. In a lot of places, the groundwater is cooler in summer than it is in the landscape generally, and we know that many wetlands are dominated by groundwater discharge. So one might say that it's likely that wetlands at least maintain the ambient water temperature, and in some cases may cool that temperature, but it also depends on the amount of shade. And this gets pretty complex when you think about forest practices. Removing the trees removes the shade, but it also pops the water table to the surface in a lot of cases, which may have a counter effect in terms of cooling. This whole thing has not been researched in wetlands here in the Pacific Northwest, and it's one thing that we do hope to do. So these effects we feel probably depend, as with streams, on geology, on the wetland type, the connectivity to the landscape, the climate, the position in the watershed, harvest intensity, duration. You know, many factors can influence that. And here, again, you know, we have a forested wetland with water actually going right through it, probably a floodplain forested wetland. Here is more up higher up in more a headwater situation. This is in southeast Alaska, where I do a lot of my work. So some other things we can speculate on that forest practices, timber harvest, may increase wind throw within wetlands. We know that in wetlands, a lot of trees have shallow roots because it's very anoxic, and when they first get a start, it's a very harsh environment. So trees are often not well rooted in wetlands and therefore may be more prone to wind throw. Light penetration, you harvest the trees, perhaps more algae, although as we heard yesterday, that's a complex relationship. And that increased algae may mean more aquatic invertebrates. There's a study of forest practices in Minnesota in some vernal pool wetlands that found that to be true. We don't know here in the Northwest. Non-native plants, as with many timber operations, are introduced. And here in the Pacific Northwest, reed canary grass is highly invasive in wetlands and has been in some cases introduced intentionally for erosion control, decimating the native flora within wetlands. Shade-intolerant plants, one would expect to decrease. One would expect that some of the mosses and lichens that are highly sensitive to microclimate might decrease, have different wildlife, and soil erosion and export could change as a result. Less certain things in terms of speculation, higher water levels post-harvest could mean more access for fish. So you're expanding your network up into the headwaters perhaps a little bit more. But logging roads can also, as we know, block off access if they're not appropriately culverted. We don't know what the implications are if we allow more fish to get up into the headwaters. Is that going to harm some of the amphibian populations in the headwaters? Higher water levels mean shorter retention time. That could mean less processing of pollutants on the landscape by wetlands. We know wetlands, a lot of wetlands can be filters, purifiers of the water. But if we change the duration, that could change their function. The timing and seasonal persistence of surface water, we need to look at that. Logging, to what degree does logging mimic natural disturbances? We know that wetlands, there are many natural disturbances in wetlands. And so that needs to be considered too. What is the baseline that we're trying to compare with? Looking at the time that it takes after a forested wetland is harvested, how long does it take just for the trees and the vegetation to come back, and do they come back the same? How drastically different might they come back, and what are the implications then for wildlife if they come back as a different community? Maybe not on an individual wetland level, but on a cumulative landscape level. There could be some implications if we're constantly flipping these wetlands to a different vegetation type. Looking at WMZs in wildlife, it's not just the harvest of timber in the wetlands, it's also the harvest of timber around wetlands. What are the implications? How wide do the WMZs have to be to minimize some of the impacts that I've just discussed in the last minute? What are the consequences of vegetation change in wetlands? Are we ending up with a lot of these cedar swamps and hemlock forested wetlands being converted to alder? And what are, if they flip over to alder, that has implications for nutrient flux on the landscape and for wildlife. And it can be a relatively persistent condition before conifers come back in again. And what does that mean? Soil compaction with timber operations in or around wetlands. What does that do for amphibians and their dispersal and their need during the summertime for upland microclimate areas? And pesticides, not just, the direct effects seem relatively minor, but what about some of the effects on food chains and the indirect cumulative effects? We just don't know. So I'd like to conclude this presentation by just mentioning the one study that comes closest to studying wetlands in forested landscapes of the Pacific Northwest, and this is Jack Janish's and other folks that are probably here today, the study on the Olympic Peninsula. And I would just like to quote from this study because it emphasizes that wetlands are not just some minor feature on the landscape that we need to ignore. They really are hydrologically very important in some landscapes. Janish and others did a survey of headwater streams in 30 watersheds in the Coast Range and found 2.3 wetlands per first order channel. And they said, were our sample representative, every 1,000 such catchments would support on the average about 19 hectares of wetlands not typically surveyed. A lot of these wetlands are not mapped. Given that river miles of headwaters greatly exceed that of the main stem rivers, headwater wetland area could, in rugged topography, rival or exceed that of lowlands. Whether wetland area or stream area dominates headwater catchments is thus a key question. Now, we have been studying type N streams, and I'm glad we have, but I cite this as just a very eloquent way of saying that we also need to study these headwater wetlands and other wetlands and the effects of forest practices on them. So that's my first talk, and any questions?
Is there a possibility of issues with methyl mercury mobilization with regard to management of forested wetlands?
There could be. You know, wetlands, as you may know, do because of the carbon being high in carbon, there is the potential when there's disturbance in wetlands that mercury could be mobilized, but I'm not willing to speculate on that. I don't think we have enough information right now to really say, but it is something that deserves to be looked at, I would agree.